Input in second language acquisition. Crescen's input hypothesis. Now, if we were talking about the facilitation provided by the input of child-directed speech, then in getting inspiration from Crescen's input hypothesis, in a similar fashion, we can also ask ourselves how good is what we call foreigner talk in second language acquisition. So, foreigner talk is also simplified talk, very similar to child-directed speech. The only difference is that it is used with foreigners on the assumption that they do not understand the language as such. So it is simplified. It is pidgin-like variety. Pidgin is again a variety which is simplified of a language, and it is usually used when you go abroad in a country and people realize that you might not know a language and they try to talk to you that way. The question is that how would it affect the second language learning process? And if we try to investigate it in the light of Crescen's input hypothesis, then this would mean that it actually might be very helpful for somebody staying outside to learn a language. So let us remind ourselves what Crescen's hypothesis was. Now, Crescen's claimed that comprehensible input, that is, an input of language that a learner can understand, is not only necessary for second language learning, but it is sufficient. It is just enough for learning of the second language to take place. And then he argued also that language learning will only take place if the learner at the stage of, for instance, I, receives a language input which is just a step above his level, his or her level, like I+1. So, another claim made by Crescen was that this claim, we can say, is quite in opposition with the output hypothesis, which is placed forth by Swain. While Swain said that people learn a second language by speaking it or by attempting to use it, Crescen has no role for the output of a language. He says speaking a language is a result of acquisition and not its cause. So people can only speak a language if they have acquired a language, and they do not acquire a language because of speaking it. Rather, it is the other way around. He also argued in this hypothesis that if the input is understood, if the language spoken and presented to the learner, which we call over here input, if it is understood and if there is sufficient quantity of it, there is enough of it, then we don't need to learn the grammar, because the grammatical structures will automatically, subconsciously be learned by the learner. So we don't need to do any explicit grammar teaching. He also pointed out that there are 3 stages in which this input is turned into intake. So what you give or what is presented to the learner is changed into intake, or something that is taken in by the learner. The first thing is understanding a second language from step A to step B. like being presented with an input which is slightly above the level of the learner, but not too beyond it, so that there is still comprehension possible. The second thing is that the learner notices a gap, a difference between his or her own stage or rule of second language, that is I stage, and the one stage. And he or she is able to understand that the way he or she thought that the language worked is not correct. So there is a gap, and he or she reorganizes that rule in his or her mind. The third stage is that there is reappearance of a I+1 form with minimal frequency. That means there is a repetition in which these forms are presented to the learner, at least at some minimum level. However, later on, when Crescent presented his hypothesis, he did not place emphasis on noticing the gap, and also this concept of noticing the gap and readjusting the interlanguage was not consistently argued by Crescent. It was almost as if you expose a child to a language and learning or acquisition would just happen almost subconsciously or automatically, and this is also one of the causes of its greatest criticisms of his hypothesis.